Everybody. This is a short presentation on final reviews for the FPLE. I've shared this material with the apprentices earlier on today. It's Wednesday. So I'm going to make this available to all the mentors and anybody else who might be interested. As ever, I have a photograph from my friend and colleague, Rosie Barnes. You can find her website pretty easy. This is from a project she did called Siblings, and it's based really on the siblings of children and adults with disabilities. Just like this photograph because it's kind of joyful in its own way, and kind of hoping that the end of the FPLE will have a similar level of joy and happiness involved. So just a little bit of context. You know this already, probably know quite a bit of what I'm about to share with you, but just to set the scene. We're assessing against the end of last placement or final placement of the PCF. Obviously, you can find that on the BASWAL website, and also to meet the IAT standards. In the main, apprentices will guide you through this. Their index of evidence generally shows that they know what they're doing. So we are expecting that they do 100 practice learning experience days doing complex work. Doesn't all have to be complex, but in their final year, we would expect them to be engaging with things that they haven't up to this point in their course. It's building on the contrasting learning experience. And if you wanted to find out about placements in general, Social Work England are very clear on the requirements for placements, and we build our processes around those expectations. So what we talk about today, well, welcome back. That's always an open invitation. Contact me if you're in doubt about anything. Coming to the end of the FPLE, you'll be completing final reviews. In fact, some people already have done so. So we'll say a little bit about the expectations and requirements of that, a little bit about professional standards, but not too much, but also to mark the ending of a long journey and the nearing of the next chapter. Roles and responsibilities are clearly laid out in the on-the-job learning handbook. So I don't intend to go through those here today, but if you want me to mail you a copy of that, I'm more than happy to do so, to perhaps offer some clarification if you have any doubt about any aspect of any of this. So some apprentices have completed their 100 days or are very near to doing so. There might be lessons for us about the timing of placements next year, but really quite happy that they have sufficient flexibility to be able to get their portfolios in a good time on the 17th of June, and that hopefully in the coming weeks they will have enough time to do everything that needs to be done. They do have one final taught module to be done, and that's 6015, Developing Creative Ideas for Professional Practice, due on the 24th of July. And they're already preparing on that. Some very interesting projects. They had to do a brief presentation last week about this, and some really great ideas, some of which will actually make their way into the real world. 17th of July, or sorry, June, 17th of June is our focus today. So what's the portfolio look like? Well, very similar to previous portfolios, very similar content. It's the quality of the content is what we're focusing on this occasion. The portfolio is 60% of the total marks for the module, so it's quite a lot. These are the various elements of the portfolio. I shall return later on in the presentation about what each of these things are. So moving on to the next one, they also have to do two critical analyses. Now you might or might not be able to help with these, but I can guarantee you that I am looking for evidence that they have used supervision and reflection to do appropriate casework, to talk through the complexities of some of the work they're being involved in. And on the drafts I have seen so far, I can definitely see evidence of that happening. So really for mentors, on-site supervisors, managers, that really is the most important part of your role. They might share that work with you, they might not, that's up to themselves. So they're basically 2,000 words each, but 500 words is for a description. And really what I want to see is the analysis element, that they can reflect, seek advice and support, guidance, meaningful and real engagement with persons with lived experience. But at the end of the day, there's usually a decision of some description to be made. They have two options. One is focusing entirely on assessment and risk management. And then they have three options for the second one. You can see here, impact of legislation, policy and procedures. And again, it's not quite enough to know what Section 47 of the CARE Act or Section 42 of the CARE Act or Section 47 of the Children's Act are. They have to be able to say, well, what does this look like in the real world, in practice? What kind of dilemmas, how it can be used effectively, and perhaps not so well. An element of that might overlap with multi-professional working and team working, but since that's such a fundamental of social work practice these days, they can just focus on that aspect of their work or on anti-discriminatory or anti-oppressive practice. So just kind of a brief background. So how would we expect reflection to develop over the life of the course as a whole? In the first year, we're asking just for 1,000 words on reflection and practice learning. In fact, I'm reading those at the moment from that particular cohort. And that's more about professional identity transitions, starting to use evidence and reflection as core tools of social work and so on. And obviously we need a bit of human development over the life course, the legal and policy context. We're not asking for a great deal of criticality in that, but certainly apprentices do start to kind of reflect a bit more critically. But in the second year on the CLE, we definitely expect to see that. As you can see, we're asking for 1,000 words reflections and thinking about reflection in context, the broader context of discrimination and bias as it appears in social work practice and in society, perhaps more general. Thinking about best practice and the use of evidence, and again, in a critical way to kind of explore and examine assumptions in our practice, perhaps, and things of that nature. And in the final year, it's that working out, that critical analysis bit, how we come to decision making, because as social workers, we often have to make important decisions about people's lives, where a person might live, who they might live with, who they can interact with, so on and so forth. Really kind of important decisions that sometimes involve restriction of liberty. So those kind of decisions are not to be undertaken lightly. We need to kind of think very carefully about how they're done. So the two critical reflections that are going into their portfolio are going to be around those kind of themes. So hopefully you can see a development in reflective capacity over the life of the course. So these are the things in the final portfolio. Now, some of these not going to be all that difficult, confidentiality statement, etc. The final practice learning review, that's led by the SRA, and I will come back to that later on in the presentation. Usually they'll have already done one direct observation and might be coming up to the second one fairly soon. Some people have done two. One of those by the SRA and one of those usually by the mentor or other professional. If in doubt, get in touch and we can negotiate. The feedbacks obviously are going to be linked to those observations. The index of evidence, as you'll see shortly, carries quite a lot of weight in the portfolio. We do expect feedback from professionals, etc., and an attendance record. So let's have a little bit more detail about those. This is how the marking for the portfolio breaks down. So the whole portfolio, 60% of the marks, the other 40% for the critical analysis. As you can see, there's quite a heavy weighting for three items: the agreement and reviews, the direct observations, and if you include the feedback, that's a fair amount of marks there, and the index of evidence. There's a rationale for that. For the confidentiality statement, 5 marks for signing the confidentiality agreement. You might kind of think, oh, okay, well, you don't have to do that. Clearly, it's the apprentice. But we won't mark portfolios if they are not signed. So that could cause a delay, perhaps, in somebody getting their final marks. It has to be a signature, not typed. And in a sense, when a person is signing that, they are agreeing to the statement, which essentially means there's no PLE details or ways which people with lived experience might be identified in the portfolio. Generally not a problem. I have found it a problem on other courses, funnily enough, but not so much in the apprentices. I suppose there is a note here for mentors. There are quite a few places where you are asked to sign the final review, and you're kind of making an undertaking, really, that the evidence for practice does exist in the real world, and that you are aware of it. So you are kind of making an agreement, I suppose, in a sense, with the university about the reality of the apprentice's practice. So we do 6 direct observations in the course overall. For the 5th and 6th one, usually the 5th one is done by the SRA, and then it's probably the mentors doing the 6th one, even though there's going to be a little bit of flexibility in that. But I don't think we'll spend any time today on the exceptions to the rule, as it were. If in doubt, ask me. So we are looking for evidence of more complex work, but it doesn't have to be always the most complex things or the most difficult or challenging things. So mix and match, use your professional discretion. But in the main, what I have seen so far is work that's kind of progressing over time. And in fact, with their critical analysis, we seem to have, broadly speaking, 2 kind of main types. A case that has been worked over a longer period of time and might come to a conclusion towards the end of the FPLE, or practice moments that were very important for the apprentice's learning. So a lot of the time, the direct observations are centered in a similar sort of a way. We're looking for that evidence of reflection and for professional curiosity. I think we'd all agree that's kind of appropriate at this stage in the apprentice's learning. I'm expecting feedback from the observers, that there will be suggestions for practice development, and action planning will be, I suppose, tightly focused on specific issues that might arise from the direct observation. And from the SRAs in particular, I would like to see suggestions for reading and research, so to expand the kind of knowledge base around particular issues that come up in the observations. And of course, we always need to see PLE feedback. In this portfolio, we ask for 2 feedbacks from professionals, and as I kind of note here, that's what it says on the tin. There's a pro forma for this, but the feedbacks are not from the SRA, line manager, or mentor. Now, I've had a query about line managers. My line manager, I think that's acceptable. I find in the course in general that there are always exceptions, and there are always room for debate, discussion, etc., etc. If in doubt, contact me, your SRA. I'm sure we can work it through. There is an attendance record. Again, mentors are asked to sign this. It's not graded. Apprentices do have to complete a minimum of 100 days of the FPLE. That's a Social Work England requirement. There's no getting around it. So that must be done. On occasion, it will happen that an apprentice has to complete the days after the portfolio, usually only a small amount of days, but the days do have to be completed. So again, if you're in doubt about the attendance record or anything of that nature, get in touch with me. Mostly we can resolve any problems that might arise. Not going to cause a great deal of problem, I don't think, but get in touch. There is a little common box here. Now, the SRA signed this rather than the mentors, and this relates to the Social Work England professional standards. Now, as you will all know, Social Work England do not regulate students, but they do have an expectation that students will be familiar with the Social Work England professional standards by the end of their final placement. So we did an exercise on these standards in class. We kind of went through them in some detail. And the SRA is expected to sign this statement here, which by now you would have read. Really, if the evidence for the PCF and the IATE apprenticeship standards is strong, then that will align very strongly with Social Work England standards. So usually this is not going to be contentious, but it is different from previous portfolio content. So the FPLE agreement and reviews, index of evidence, do carry most of the marks, but they are collaborative. So in a sense, it's a bit analogous to coursework. Those things, in particular the evidence, the index of evidence should be a running total. A person should be keeping that updated all the time, and the SRA and the mentor must sign this off. So really, when you're doing that, you're saying these things really did happen, and the evidence, should somebody want to look at it, is there in the workplace. So the final review is going to be completed by the SRA, and it is very strongly linked, of course, to the index of evidence. The index, in a sense, is the pivot around which the rest of the portfolio circulates, if you will. So the process, quite funny here, my first sentence, I noticed, really should be in person or face-to-face or online. A lot of the meetings will be online. If it's easier to do a face-to-face, that's fine. Really, there isn't that much in it. It's more about what's the easiest to achieve. What can you do most effectively? There's an expectation that the index of evidence and attendance record should be completed before the meeting. Mentors have particular sections to do in that final review. It will be really helpful for both the mentor, the apprentice, and the SRE to have those in good time before you actually meet up to discuss the final review in more detail. So, like, heads up, guys, if you can do that in, like, rather than the day before, that would be helpful, I think. It is okay to complete the final review after 100 days. I've been asked this question by apprentices a few times, but really we're thinking about that submission on the 17th of June and trying to give the SRA in particular enough time to complete that final report before then. So really you should be aiming for the end of May to get most of these portfolios completed. For the meeting, you kind of think, well, first of all, who should be there? Apprentice, mentor, SRA, I would say, will be the kind of minimum requirements. There may be an on-site supervisor, sometimes a line manager might be doing that job. So those 4 people will probably be the core of the meeting. On occasion, people invite managers. That may or may not have value, certainly not required. I think you should allow reasonable time for that meeting, at least an hour, possibly an hour and a half. A typical way of doing it is literally working through the PCF one by one, and then later linking that to the IATE using the spreadsheet provided. Kind of shows you how to map those standards against each other. So what I find is when you start talking about the PCF, the index of evidence obviously is informing that discussion, but other things actually come out in the discussion. Kind of, oh, do you remember this case and that case, etc., etc. So a more narrative approach actually generates more evidence, in my experience. APTEM, the tripartite agreements, well, we did try. We put forward a case, in fact, on more than one occasion, to Kingston University to reduce the number of tripartites from 4 to 3. And that was agreed, but only in the next academic year. So really, mostly, I think, apprentices probably have done 2. They may have done 3, but they'll have to do 4. So my suggestion is 3 could be done around the same time as the final review. It might be overloading that meeting to expect all of that to be done in the same meeting, as in the final review, going through the PCF and the tripartite. You might have to separate them out. But really, the tripartite can be a bureaucratic exercise, and it might easily be done by email there might not be a need for an additional meeting. You do, as a mentors, of course, have to contribute to that, but really most of the information about progress should be in the actual review as distinct from the tripartite. So there's enough room and time, and my suggestion is that the fourth tripartite agreement can happen after the final review has been submitted in June. So I would suggest sometime between, say, the 17th of June and perhaps the 24th of July, when the final submission for SW6016 is due. So sometime in that period there, that's probably a good time to do that final tripartite. So a little bit about the critical analysis. I've said already kind of what options are available to people. So just a little bit more detail on that. I've done a previous session on this, but just to kind of remind you why analysis and what analysis. So obviously analysis, detailed examination, something to get under its skin, as it were, to understand it in more detail. And in social work texts, analysis often includes how we think, linking to critical theory, and creating and testing hypotheses. So breaking things down into their constituent parts, but there are other important elements of analysis. Now, you may or may not have come across this textbook. This is core reading of the course. Students seem to actually quite like this. It's by Chris Dyke, who is a member of our staff. It's the third edition of this. Kind of indicates that people are buying it and find it useful. And if you get a chance to have a look, I think anybody could, in fact, benefit from this. So why is analysis important? Well, we're dealing with complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty all the time. We're not making decisions about ourselves, but we need to be making well-reasoned or defensible judgments. We have to analyze limited, disparate information, etc., etc. And I think one of the key things here is to avoid bias in our decision making, to subject our process of decision making to rigorous analysis, and avoid making, first of all, bad decisions, but second of all, it's one of the best ways to avoid bias and discrimination in what we do. Research and practice kind of suggest that there's different modes of thinking. Lots of research and evidence literature about this. So we have to be thinking about our analysis, our hypothesizing, and putting forward different kind of reasons or explanations for why things might be turning out like they are, weighing up then different options in our critical thinking, interpretations, sources of evidence, and indeed evidence that conflicts with perhaps our initial ideas about a case. We know in social work that happens a lot, but at the same time, we also have to include intuition. There's a lot written about this. A popular textbook has been Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. But they suggest that analysis is precise, objective, rational, requires effort to work through. Intuition, a bit more imprecise and prone to bias. And in short, in a kind of a way, intuition is louder. It's telling us messages, this is how the situation, this is how it is. And it's quick to jump to conclusions. And we need to balance that with analysis. So we don't make stupid decisions, essentially, really. Both types of thinking are going on. Sometimes you'll see, oh, left brain, right brain doing different things. That's not how the brain works. The two things, the brain is a kind of very complex sort of organism and has incredibly complex processes. And the two are informing each other consistently. But it turns out that analysis is effortful. You have to try hard at it in order to counteract intuition on occasion, and sometimes to unpack intuition, try to get a better understanding of what our initial gut feeling might be. So Turney, Brown and Turney here, again, looking at critical case analysis and things of that nature, suggesting that we should be thinking about what makes me think that. Very useful question to answer. Again, Kahneman and Klein talked about the conditions for intuitive expertise. It's kind of an interesting idea. The idea was, though, that the two of them come from very different schools of decision making. One talks about the intuitive expertise that a person builds up over a lifetime, and the other is talking about the more analytical, step by step, using evidence in a purposeful way. And rather than being, excuse me, at odds with each other, what they suggest is that these two different modes of thinking or ways of making decisions are complementary and are necessary indeed for the best of decision-making processes. So you may have a lot of questions as ever. It's an open door here. If you want to ask anything about any of the processes involved or the assessments or the documents, you can always talk to your SRA, of course. SRAs would be very open to answer any questions you might have, or you may contact me directly. You may do so by email or by phone in the usual manner, and I'm more than happy if you get in touch. I suppose really with the apprentices we're thinking of, they're nearly there. And it's been a long journey. Some of them are a bit exhausted. I hope they don't get gate fever. They see the light at the end of the tunnel and there's a tendency to run towards the light. But in the main, I've got no major concerns about anyone's progress. I expect them all to complete their studies, to become qualified social workers, and indeed to do very well. We expect quite a lot of firsts. But that don't matter. Nobody will ever ask you again in your life what your mark was for your final portfolio. It's the qualification to become a registered and qualified professional is the most important thing by a long chalk. So that's it for me today. I'm going to end the recording here. And thank you very much for the support of the apprentices that you have offered throughout. They essentially do not succeed without your input. So you could be proud of yourself, really, that you have helped creating the next generation of social workers for our wonderful profession. See you later. Bye.